I never thought a simple camping trip could go so wrong. Looking back, I should have known better. The signs were all there, but sometimes you only see the warnings when it's too late. It was late September, and I wanted a break from everything. Work had been draining me, and the city was suffocating. I needed some fresh air, quiet, and the feeling of being away from people. So, I packed up my gear and drove out to a remote camping spot in northern Minnesota. I had been there before, once years ago, but I remembered it being quiet, secluded, and perfect for a solo trip. I reached the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to drop behind the thick trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path. The site itself was nothing fancy, just a small clearing surrounded by dense woods, a fire ring made of old stones, and a rotting picnic table covered in moss. It was miles away from any main road, with nothing but forest in every direction. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck a little off the trail, grabbed my gear, and started setting up. I pitched my tent near a large tree, close enough to provide some shelter in case of rain, but not too close to risk falling branches. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. After setting up, I gathered firewood. The forest floor was covered in dead branches, making it easy. As I worked, I felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I stopped, looked around, and saw nothing but trees. Just my mind playing tricks on me. I told myself it was normal to feel a little on edge when alone in the woods. By nightfall, the fire was crackling, and I sat in my camping chair, eating a quick meal. The temperature had dropped, and the air had that crisp autumn chill. Felt good, peaceful. Then, somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped. I froze, listening. It wasn't a small twig breaking under a squirrel's weight. It was heavier, deliberate. My eyes scanned the darkness beyond the fire's glow, but I saw nothing. The trees formed an impenetrable wall of black. I tried to shake it off, probably just a deer moving through the brush, but something about it made my skin crawl. I kept the fire going longer than usual that night. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my knife within reach, just in case. Morning came with a heavy fog. The air was damp, and everything felt colder than it should have. I made coffee, walked around the site, and decided to explore a little. About a mile from my campsite, I found an old, overgrown trail. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curiosity got the best of me, and I followed it. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Something was off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. Then I found something. A small clearing like my campsite but abandoned. An old fire ring half buried in the dirt. A few rusted cans scattered around. And a tree deep in the center with deep scratches on its bark. Not animal scratches. These were long, deep gouges, too deliberate, too precise. Something about that place made my stomach turn. I backed away and left, moving faster than before. I reached my campsite and tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't. I told myself it was just an old campsite, nothing sinister, but I couldn't stop thinking about those scratches. That night, I kept my fire high again. Around midnight, I heard movement in the trees. Slow, steady, not the quick rustling of an animal. This was something deliberate. I gripped my knife and stared into the darkness. Nothing moved, but I knew something was there. Then something changed. The air felt different, heavy. The fire flickered, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I should have left. I don't know why I stayed. That morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite, moving around my tent, stopping near the fire. Someone had been here while I slept. My gut told me to pack up and go, but part of me didn't want to believe it. I convinced myself it was old tracks, maybe my own from the day before. I stayed. Big mistake. That night, I barely let the fire die down. I sat awake, listening. The woods were dead silent. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. Breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. Slow, steady. Coming from the darkness just beyond the fire's glow. I held my knife so tight my hand ached. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then a low, slow scrape, metal against wood. I jumped to my feet, shining my flashlight. Nothing. But I knew someone was out there. I didn't sleep. I kept my fire going until dawn. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up fast, barely eating. But as I loaded my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. Hanging from a tree near my campsite was a rope. A noose. It hadn't been there before. I didn't think. I just threw my gear into the truck, jumped in, and started driving. The narrow dirt road felt longer than before, every shadow between the trees making my heart race. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure standing in the trees. Tall, motionless, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. It took me nearly an hour to reach the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I will never camp alone again. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some warnings should never be ignored. And some people, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise, are capable of things you don't want to imagine. I don't camp alone anymore. I used to love the stillness, the quiet hum of the wind through the trees, the feeling of being far away from the weight of life. But that was before that night, before I learned that not everything in the woods is what it seems. It was late October, just starting to get cold enough to see your breath at night. I had planned a weekend out in the mountains of Wyoming, nothing extreme, just a few miles off the trail, far enough from other people to enjoy the peace. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, some dried food, a good knife, and my rifle. I always brought my rifle, not because I expected trouble, but because things live out there that you don't want to meet unarmed. I parked my truck near a ranger station, checked the map, and started hiking. The first few hours were easy. Sunlight streamed through the thinning leaves, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the air. Felt good to be away. No people, no noise, just me and the wild. By late afternoon, I found a decent clearing beside a stream. Perfect spot. Flat ground, plenty of dry wood for a fire, fresh water nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some kindling, and got a fire going before the sun dipped too low. The wind had picked up a little, rustling through the trees in long, steady breaths. As I sat by the fire, eating a bit of jerky, I noticed something. The woods were off. I've camped enough to know how the forest sounds at night. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustling of some small animal moving through the underbrush. But here it was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. I brushed it off. Some places just feel different, that's all. Maybe the wind had scared off the smaller creatures. Maybe I was just overthinking it. By the time the sun had fully set, the fire was strong, and the cold had started creeping in. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent, made sure my rifle was close, and settled in for the night. I don't know how long I had been asleep before I woke up. The fire outside had died down to just glowing embers, casting faint red light across the clearing. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. There was no sound, no movement, just that feeling again, that something was wrong. Then I heard it, a slow, dragging noise just beyond the tree line. Not footsteps, not the quick scurry of an animal. It was deliberate, heavy, like something was pulling itself through the leaves. I reached for my rifle, listening. The sound stopped. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Then, from the dark, came a sound that nearly made me drop the gun. It was my name, not loud, not a shout, just a whisper, stretched and wrong, like someone struggling to shape the words. Jake. I don't scare easy, but hearing my name come out of the darkness like that, from a voice that wasn't quite right, sent ice through my veins. I gripped my rifle tighter, waiting. Silence. Then movement. Something shifted at the edge of the firelight. A shape just barely visible between the trees. I raised the rifle, aiming toward it, but the light was too dim. I could only make out the outline. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were long, almost stretched, like it had been pulled into the wrong shape. Then it stepped forward. The firelight caught its face, and I stopped breathing. It was me, or something trying to be me. The features were close, but not quite right. The skin too smooth, the mouth just a little too wide, the eyes dark and empty. It was like looking at a reflection in a broken mirror. I didn't think. I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees. The thing jerked, stumbled back, but didn't fall. It didn't bleed, just stood there, head tilted, watching me. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile, too wide, stretching the skin in ways that shouldn't be possible. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and ran. Left the tent, the fire, everything. Just ran. I could hear it moving behind me, keeping pace. The way it moved wasn't natural. Too smooth, too quiet, like it wasn't touching the ground. Branches whipped past me as I tore through the woods, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. My truck was miles away, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then the worst sound I've ever heard in my life filled the air. Laughter. Not real laughter. Not human. It was distorted, high and low at the same time, like it was trying to figure out how to make the sound. And it was right behind me. I pushed harder, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. The trees blurred around me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, the ground sloped down and I could see the road. My truck. I didn't slow down. I hit the door, yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut just as something crashed against the side. The whole truck rocked. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into gear and punched the gas. As the truck lurched forward, I dared a glance in the mirror. It was standing in the middle of the road, watching me. The smile still stretched across its face. And then, just before I lost sight of it, it waved, like it was saying goodbye. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people, by streetlights, by anything that wasn't the dark. I parked in my driveway, hands still shaking, and sat there until the sun started to rise. I never went back for my gear. I never went camping alone again. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind is still, I swear I hear my name, spoken just wrong enough to know it isn't me. I had been on the road for most of the day, my truck tires kicking up dirt and mud as I made my way deeper into the mountains. The rain had started in the afternoon, light at first, then heavier as the evening came. I was used to roughing it out in the woods, camping alone in remote places, but something about the thick, gray clouds rolling in over the peaks unsettled me. Still, I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back just because of a little bad weather. The campsite I had in mind was a clearing near a river, tucked away from the main road, where hardly anyone came. I had been there once before, years ago, and remembered it as a quiet place, perfect for a solo night in the wild. But as I pulled my truck off the narrow dirt road and into the clearing, I could tell the rain had changed the land. The ground was softer, muddier, with deep tracks from water running downhill. The trees looked darker, their trunks slick with rain, and the river rushed louder than I remembered, swollen from the storm. I shut off the engine and sat for a minute, listening to the rain tapping against the roof. The wind had picked up, shaking the branches above me. I took a deep breath, grabbed my gear, and stepped out. My boots sank into the wet earth, making a sucking sound as I walked toward a flat patch of ground. Setting up the tent was harder than usual. The rain made everything heavier, the ropes slipped through my fingers, and the wind fought against me. By the time I got it upright, my clothes were soaked through. I built a small fire with what little dry wood I could find under fallen logs, sheltering it from the rain with a makeshift windbreak of stones. The fire sputtered, barely giving off any warmth, but it was something. I sat on a log, eating a cold sandwich from my pack, listening to the rain and the rushing river. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing through the trees, making strange noises in the distance. But as I sat there, chewing slowly, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the trees at all. It was lower, steadier. Footsteps in the mud. I turned my head slightly, trying to listen past the rain. The steps were slow, deliberate, not the sound of an animal moving through the woods. My hand tightened around the knife at my belt. I glanced around, but the fire cast only a weak glow, and the trees beyond it were nothing but black shapes against the gray sky. If someone was out there, they were standing just beyond the reach of the light. I waited, my breath slow and controlled, but the sound stopped. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was just the rain playing tricks on me. But then it started again. Closer. I stood up, gripping my knife, scanning the darkness. The fire crackled behind me, its light making it harder to see beyond the immediate area. My truck was only a few feet away, the doors locked, the rifle inside. I thought about making a move for it, but I didn't want to turn my back to the woods. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If someone was out there, they hadn't tried to approach the fire. They were just watching, waiting. The rain continued to fall, making it harder to hear anything beyond its steady drumming. I waited for what felt like forever, but the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just an animal after all, something moving through the brush and gone now. I sat back down, keeping my knife close. The fire burned low, and the rain made me too cold to sit still. I decided to turn in for the night, crawling into my tent and zipping it up tight. My gear was inside with me, my knife tucked into my sleeping bag. I lay there, listening to the rain hammer against the tent. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something was outside. It wasn't the rain or the wind this time. It was breathing, close. I didn't move. My hand slowly found my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle. The breathing was just outside the tent wall, low and steady. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They were letting me know they were there. I held my breath, waiting. The seconds stretched. The rain kept falling. Then, a slow, dragging sound, like a hand running along the fabric of the tent. My stomach clenched. I gripped my knife tighter. I could see the faintest outline of a shadow through the thin material. Someone was crouched right outside. I forced myself to move. In one quick motion, I sat up, throwing my hand against the side of the tent, making the fabric jump. The breathing stopped. Silence. I listened, every muscle in my body tense. Nothing. Then, footsteps. Fast, heavy, retreating into the woods. I unzipped the tent in one motion, knife in hand, stepping out into the rain. My fire was dead. The clearing was empty. I shined my flashlight around, sweeping the trees. No movement, just rain and darkness. But the footprints were there, deep in the mud, leading right up to my tent. I wasn't imagining it. Whoever had been out there was real. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my gear, throwing it into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care that my tent was still standing. I left it behind. I climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The truck rumbled to life. My headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the clearing. And that's when I saw him, just beyond the tree line, standing perfectly still, watching. I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires spinning in the mud as I backed onto the road. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove through the rain, down that winding dirt road, not stopping until I hit the highway miles away. Only then did I finally pull over, my hands still gripping the wheel, my breath coming in fast, shaky gulps. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I never went back to that campsite again. It was early autumn when I decided to go on a camping trip. The days were getting shorter, and the air had that crisp feeling that came with the changing seasons. I had been meaning to get away for a while, away from work, away from everything that had been weighing on my mind. The past few months had been exhausting, and I needed time to clear my head. I packed my truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, a hunting rifle just in case. I was heading to a secluded area deep in the woods, a place I had visited once before but never stayed overnight. It wasn't an official campsite, just a patch of forestland far enough from civilization to feel truly isolated. That was what I wanted. Solitude. As I drove, the roads became narrower, the trees taller. The further I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. The last stretch of my drive was a dirt road, uneven and full of potholes. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid damaging my truck. It was around this time that I passed my old boss's campsite. I recognized his truck immediately. A black Ford, covered in dirt, parked just off the road near a clearing. I hadn't seen him in years. He had retired unexpectedly, just up and quit one day without any warning. It had been strange at the time. He wasn't the type to just walk away from a job, but he had, and no one ever really knew why. I glanced at his campsite as I passed. There was a tent, a small fire pit with no fire, and what looked like a pile of gear sitting outside the tent flap. But I didn't see him. I kept driving. Something about that campsite stuck with me, though. There was something off about it. It looked abandoned almost. The gear had been sitting out like someone had left in a hurry. The truck was there, but there were no signs of movement. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he had gone for a hike. Maybe he was just inside the tent, resting. Either way, it wasn't my problem. I kept going until I reached my own campsite, a few miles deeper into the woods. I parked my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath of the cool, fresh air. There was no cell service out here, no traffic noise, just the sounds of the forest, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. I set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, got a small fire going before the sun set. I ate a quick meal, listened to the distant sounds of the woods, and let myself finally relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I barely slept. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I felt uneasy. I kept thinking about my old boss's campsite, how strange it had looked. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind played out different scenarios. What if something had happened to him? What if he was hurt? What if he wasn't alone? At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up just before dawn. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily silent. Normally, the early morning would be filled with bird calls, the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But there was nothing, just silence. I got up, stretched, and decided to check on my old boss's campsite. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I made my way back along the dirt road, walking this time. The morning air was cold, and I could see my breath in front of me. The walk was longer than I remembered, but eventually, I saw the clearing where his truck had been. Only now the truck was gone. The tent was still there. The gear was still there, but the truck, the same one I had seen parked there just yesterday, was missing. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of it. Maybe he had left early. Maybe he had packed up his truck and driven out before I woke up. But why would he leave all his gear behind? His tent? His supplies? I stepped closer, scanning the campsite. The fire pit was untouched. The gear was still piled up. But now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were deep tracks in the dirt, drag marks leading away from the tent, into the trees. Something had been pulled through here. Something heavy. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around, to leave, to pretend I had never stopped here. But I couldn't. I had to know. I followed the drag marks. They led deep into the woods, winding through the trees, over uneven ground. The further I went, the more unsettled I felt. The silence was deafening. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps, crunching over fallen branches. Then I saw it. A boot, half buried in the dirt. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. The boot was old, scuffed up, but I recognized it. I had seen my boss wear that same pair of boots before. They were distinctive, with deep cracks along the leather, and they were still on his feet. I found him lying in the dirt, face down, motionless. His body was twisted at an unnatural angle, arms sprawled out like he had been dragged here and left. His clothes were torn, and his skin was pale, far too pale. I stood there, frozen. I wanted to believe he was still alive, that maybe he had just passed out, but I knew better. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I grabbed my keys, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't even bother packing up my campsite. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in a place where I could get cell service. I called the police. I told them where to find him. They asked me questions, too many questions, but I didn't have answers. I didn't know what had happened to him. The official report ruled it as an accident. Maybe he had fallen, gotten injured, and died from exposure. Maybe he had been attacked by an animal. But I don't believe that, because when I think back to that moment, to when I found him lying there, there's one detail I can't forget. His truck was gone, and someone had taken it. Whoever had been out there with him, whoever had dragged his body into the woods was still out there, and they had left in his truck. I don't go camping anymore. I had always hunted alone. It wasn't because I didn't have friends or family to go with, but because I liked the silence. I liked the time away from everything. It gave me space to think, to reset, to just exist in a way that I couldn't when surrounded by people. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for me, it was a way of life. I grew up learning how to track, how to wait, how to be patient. This trip was no different. I had planned it months in advance, choosing a spot deep in the wilderness of British Columbia. I had hunted in these forests before, but never this deep. The area was vast, filled with dense trees, steep inclines, and long-forgotten trails. The nearest town was over 60 miles away, and I liked it that way. No people, no distractions. I packed light but efficiently. My rifle, my sidearm, a good amount of ammunition. A tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear. Enough food to last in case the hunting didn't go as planned. My GPS, my map, my compass. I wasn't some amateur wandering into the wild without a clue. I knew these forests. I had studied the terrain. I had checked the weather reports. The drive out took the better part of a day. The last few miles were on an old logging road, rough and barely maintained. My truck handled it well, though, and by the time I reached the spot I had marked, it was late afternoon. I parked at the end of the road and took a moment to take everything in. The trees were thick, towering above me, their dark green needles swaying gently in the wind. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I gathered my gear and set off into the woods. I had to hike about 5 miles to reach the area I wanted to camp in, a small clearing near a river. It was an ideal spot, fresh water nearby, a good view of the surrounding land, and plenty of game trails crisscrossing the area. The hike was tough, mostly uphill, but I had done worse. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I set up camp quickly. My tent went up first, followed by a small fire pit. I collected wood, enough to last the night, and got a fire going. The warmth felt good after the long hike. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans and some jerky, then sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that only the wilderness could offer. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just the wind, the crackling fire, and the distant call of an owl. I went to bed early, knowing I had a long day ahead. My plan was simple: wake up before dawn, hike to a good vantage point, and wait. The area was known for elk, and if I was lucky, I'd have one by the end of the day. I fell asleep easily, the exhaustion from the hike pulling me under. But something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint light on the trees. I listened. The forest was never truly silent, but something was off. There were no crickets, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. Then I heard it, A single, heavy footstep. I stayed still, my hand moving slowly to my sidearm. My breathing was shallow, controlled. I knew better than to react too quickly. I had seen bears out here before, even mountain lions. But this didn't feel like an animal. Another footstep, closer this time. I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire. The trees were thick, their shadows shifting in the dim light. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but it was probably just minutes. Eventually, the sound stopped. The forest remained eerily quiet, but nothing came closer. I didn't go back to sleep. I just sat there, my hand on my gun, waiting. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was already packed and moving. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe my imagination, but I wasn't stupid. I wasn't going to stay in that exact spot another night. I hiked out toward the ridge I had marked for hunting. It was about 2 miles away, overlooking a valley where I had seen elk before. As I walked, I kept checking my surroundings, looking for tracks, looking for anything out of place. I found them about halfway there. Footprints, not animal, human, barefoot. The prints were large, deep, pressed into the damp earth. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day at most. I crouched down, studying them. They led in the direction of my camp. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't right. I was miles from any trails, any roads. No one should be out here, especially not barefoot. I kept moving, faster now, reaching the ridge just as the sun rose higher. I settled in, scanning the valley below with my scope. But my focus wasn't on the elk anymore. I felt watched. The hours passed. I saw movement in the distance. An elk, just as I had hoped. But I wasn't thinking about the hunt anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling. I waited until late afternoon before heading back, taking a different route to my camp. The footprints were gone. Not covered, just gone. The ground where they had been was disturbed, like someone had brushed them away. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, my rifle across my lap. Nothing happened. But the next morning, when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them. New footprints, right outside my tent. I left that morning. I didn't pack properly, didn't even eat breakfast. I just grabbed my gear and hiked back to my truck. The whole way I felt watched. The feeling never left, even as I started the engine and drove away. I never went back to that spot, and I never hunted alone again. I had always been someone who enjoyed camping alone. Some people found it strange, but I liked the solitude. I liked hearing the sounds of the woods without any distractions. No talking, no noise from other campers. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. I wasn't reckless about it. I always told someone where I was going, carried enough supplies, and stayed aware of my surroundings. But even the most careful people can run into trouble. This happened in the summer of 2018. I had taken a week off work and wanted to camp somewhere remote, far away from any trails crowded with hikers. I found a spot in northern Montana, near the edge of a national forest, miles away from any established campsites. The area wasn't well traveled, but it wasn't completely unknown either. I had done my research. There were no major predator concerns, the weather looked fine, and the landscape was perfect. Tall trees, a clear running stream nearby, and enough open space for me to set up comfortably. The first day was normal. I hiked in during the early afternoon, about 5 miles off any marked trail, and found a good clearing. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and took in the surroundings. Everything felt calm. The air smelled fresh, the stream nearby was flowing gently, and I could hear birds in the trees. I cooked my food, ate as the sun went down, and stayed up for a while watching the fire before going into my tent. The first strange thing happened that night. I woke up to the sound of snapping branches. Not just the little kind that squirrels break as they run through the undergrowth, but heavier snaps, like something big was walking nearby. I stayed still, listening. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving at night, but this was slow, It didn't sound like a deer bounding through the trees or a bear sniffing around. It was deliberate. A step, a pause, another step. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. I shined the light around the trees, but I didn't see anything. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was probably nothing and went back inside. But I had trouble falling back asleep after that. The next day, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I spent most of the day exploring, walking along the stream, making sure I had a good sense of my surroundings. I didn't see any fresh tracks of large animals nearby, which reassured me a little. I didn't do much that afternoon except gather more wood and double-check my food supply. That night, it happened again. I woke up around the same time to the sound of movement. This time, it was closer. It sounded like it was just outside my camp. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, methodical. I could hear the dry leaves and twigs crunching underfoot. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight again, and this time, I called out. No response. I waited, listening. The steps stopped. I didn't hear anything running away, no sound of something crashing through the brush. Just silence. I stayed awake for a long time, sitting in my tent, waiting to hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. Nothing obvious stood out, no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. I started to wonder if I was just hearing things, maybe a deer walking close by, but it didn't feel right. I made the decision to stay one more night, but to be extra cautious. I didn't start a fire that evening, not wanting to attract any unwanted attention. I kept my flashlight and knife close, and I forced myself to stay up as long as I could, listening. It was sometime past midnight when I heard it again. This time, I was already awake. The sound of slow, careful steps moving just beyond the reach of my tent. I felt my pulse hammering in my chest. Then, something new happened. A clicking sound, like a rock tapping against another rock. 3 slow clicks, then silence. I didn't move. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the steps move away. They faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. I didn't sleep. I waited until the first light, then packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I hiked out fast, checking behind me every so often, making sure I wasn't being followed. The whole way back to my truck, I felt like something was just behind me, watching, but I never saw anything. I don't know what it was. Maybe a person, maybe someone living out there, staying hidden. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that whatever was out there that night wasn't just passing through. I haven't camped alone since. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in nature, away from the noise of the city, that made me feel at peace. I never considered myself an expert, but I had been on enough solo trips to know what I was doing. I had camped in forests, by lakes, and in the mountains, and I always took the necessary precautions. Checking weather forecasts, bringing enough supplies, and staying aware of my surroundings. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo trip to the French countryside. I had been working non-stop for months, and I needed a break. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, away from tourists and crowded campgrounds. After searching for a while, I found a remote area near the Parc National de Cévennes, a vast, rugged landscape filled with dense forests, deep valleys, and winding rivers. It wasn't completely off the grid, but it was isolated enough that I wouldn't have to worry about running into too many people. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a small gas stove, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I had also bought a small can of bear spray just in case. I wasn't worried about bears since they were rare in that part of France, but wild boars could be aggressive, and I wanted to be prepared. The drive to the spot took longer than expected. The roads were narrow, twisting through hills and dense patches of trees. At times, I questioned if my car would make it, but eventually, I arrived at a clearing not far from a small river. The place was perfect: flat ground, plenty of space, and no signs of other campers. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and cooked myself a quick meal. As the sun began to set, I sat by the fire, listening to the distant sounds of birds and insects. The air was cool, carrying the fresh scent of damp earth and pine. I felt completely at ease, but that feeling wouldn't last. The first sign that something was wrong came just as I was getting ready to sleep. I had put out the fire, zipped up my tent, and was lying inside my sleeping bag when I heard movement outside. At first, I thought it was a small animal, maybe a rabbit or a fox, but the sound was heavier. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, after a long silence, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe a deer had wandered too close and then ran off when it noticed my tent. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up early and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the sky was a pale blue, the sun just beginning to rise over the trees. But as I walked around my campsite, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had been careful about where I stepped when I arrived, and these were fresh. The prints were deep, like someone heavy had been walking around. They circled my tent. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. There were no other tents nearby, no parked cars, no hiking trails. I had seen no one since I arrived. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I told myself it could have been a lost hiker, someone passing through, but the thought didn't sit right with me. If it had been a hiker, why hadn't they said anything? Why had they walked in circles around my tent instead of just passing by? I decided to shake it off. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping up my spine. That day, I tried to keep busy. I went for a short hike, collected more firewood, and double-checked my supplies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but whenever I turned my head, nothing was there. As the sun started to set, I decided to keep my fire going longer than the night before. The warmth and light made me feel safer. But as I sat by the flames, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a shadow moving between the trees. I turned quickly, but it was already gone. My skin prickled. Someone was there. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the woods, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The forest was silent except for the crackling of my fire. I stayed up for hours, forcing myself to keep watch. But eventually, exhaustion won and I had to sleep. I woke up to a noise. It was a soft rustling at first, like someone shifting their weight. Then, the unmistakable sound of a zipper. My tent's zipper. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The tent was dark, but I could hear the slow, careful movement of the zipper being undone from the outside. I grabbed my knife and held my breath. The zipper stopped. Silence. Then I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing just outside my tent. My body locked up. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, waiting. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in my tent, gripping my knife, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I forced myself to step outside. My firewood had been scattered. My backpack, which I had left zipped up, was open. My food was gone. And there, in the dirt, were more footprints. I didn't waste time packing up. I threw everything into my car and got out of there as fast as I could. As I drove down the narrow road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a cheap hotel for the night. It wasn't until I locked the door behind me that I finally let myself breathe. I never found out who was out there. Maybe it was some local messing with campers. Maybe it was someone living off the grid. Or maybe it was something worse. All I knew was that I wasn't going back. That was the last solo camping trip I ever took in France.